Well, good afternoon. It's a tremendously powerful report that Alex has done. It speaks to the daily reality that we in the International Rescue Committee see both in countries in the Middle East and in Africa where failed states are unable to contain conflict, and now on the shores of Europe where people are exploiting the desperation, I think that was the word she used, and it's absolutely right, the desperation of people, and the fact that there aren't properly organised and ordered routes for people either to be returned to their homes if they are not suffering from the threat of persecution, or for them to be resettled in cases where they do have that well-founded fear of persecution that is the definition of a refugee. All of the evidence that we have from people who talk to us is that the fact that these wars in Somalia, going on for 30 years, in Afghanistan, 25 years, now the Syrian conflict on top, are overwhelming the systems that exist.
And how do you make that decision, whether people should be helped to resettle or, in fact, they should be sent home?
The United Nations has a very well established definition of what it is to be a refugee. It was established after the Second World War. The definition is that someone who has a well-founded fear of persecution is a refugee as opposed to an economic migrant. And of the 60 million people that you mentioned in your introductory comments, about 20 million of them globally are refugees. There's one refugee every 5 or 6 seconds at the moment because of the number of civil wars that are going on around the world. But twice that number are internally displaced people in countries in the Middle East, but also across Africa where we work. We see lots of people who are displaced within their own homes. And the obvious response is that at a time when humanitarian aid is under pressure, we need to be doing more, if you like, upstream in countries in the Middle East, in Africa as well, because if you don't make the humanitarian efforts upstream to provide shelter, to provide healthcare, to provide education, if you don't do the work there, then the sense of desperation will grow. As I saw for myself in Niger, which is a country in the middle of Africa, it's a trade route, I'm sorry to use that word, for people who are being smuggled across Africa. And if there isn't proper provision in countries like that to halt the flow of people, then they will end up on the shores of Europe or elsewhere.
You've spoken of doing more work upstream, as you describe it. You're the CEO of International Rescue Committee. What is your organisation doing to prevent this humanitarian crisis?
I mean, we have about 15,000 staff in 30 countries around the world. We're working to provide healthcare, to provide education for kids, to ensure that there's proper water and sanitation. And it's a telltale sign of how desperate things are that we've had to deploy some of our staff to the Greek island of Lesbos, where 1,000 people are arriving a day, and where in one of the transit centres there were 5 toilets for 3,000 people. But the vast bulk of our work is in countries like Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, Iraq in the Middle East, in Congo, in Niger, as I say, where I was recently, and in Somalia itself. So we're working to try to make sure that the conditions that people are forced to live in are in fact livable, and that there is a basic modicum of dignity for them there. It has to be said that at a time when there are 60 million people fleeing conflict, at the moment it too often feels like a losing battle, and that's why the calls, which to be fair have been led by British governments of both parties, for international aid to be stepped up are well-founded.
But it does sound quite reactive. I mean, you can't prevent the wars, you can't prevent the conflict, which really is the root cause, isn't it?
You're absolutely right to say that, but I would say 2 things, partly on the basis of my experience as a foreign minister, but also now in my experience as the chief executive of a humanitarian organisation. We need far more effort on the diplomatic front to tend to those wars that do seem endless. I mean, if you take the Syria example, that's the largest humanitarian conflict in the world at the moment. It's produced more refugees, 4 million refugees from that conflict into neighbouring countries. But the whole diplomatic effort is one UN official trying to broker temporary ceasefires at the moment. The absence of a drive for a political solution in Syria, the sense of desperation in other conflicts where UN peacekeeping forces are underfunded and undermanned, that's what creates the conditions where these conflicts spill over not just into neighbouring states but onto the shores of Europe. So the first thing I would say is that there needs to be a far greater level of diplomatic attention, political attention, to the conflicts themselves. We can't just throw up our hands and say that they're insoluble. The other thing to do, of course, and to pick up your word, humanitarian organisations like ours need to plan better. We need to be sure that we're not simply in the reactive mode that you describe. And that's why organisations like IRC, we're doubling our emergency capacity, we're pre-positioning people and goods to make sure that we can respond within the 72 hours that we're pledged to do so.
And in your view, does that international attention, which perhaps might be lacking at the moment, does that include military intervention?
Well, we're a humanitarian organisation and we look to political settlements rather than military ones. The vital thing from our point of view...
A political settlement might be that perhaps military intervention is what is needed as a last resort, as it might be.
Well, obviously, in the conflicts where we're providing humanitarian help, whether in the Middle East or elsewhere, there's a range of military actors and interventions, some of them from governments, some of them from non-state jihadist players, and we have to deal with the consequences as a humanitarian organisation. Obviously, the key thing in the Syria crisis, though, is that for 4 years there has been no agreed political vision for the future of Syria. Even the Geneva talks that were brokered by Kofi Annan, the former Secretary-General of the UN, broke up within days of their conclusion with contending views about what had been agreed. And it's the absence of that political settlement that I think has empowered a whole range of radical and other groups and led to the fracturing of Syrian society in the most appalling way.
In your view, then, has the international community failed these vulnerable people? Is there something that they're not doing that they should be as of today?
There's definitely a collective failure. No one could look at the scenes that you are reporting and see anything other than, first, a failure to tackle the problems at their root cause. Secondly, a failure to establish effective humanitarian protection in the countries that are in conflict or in the neighbouring states, which is the best place to catch people, to meet their needs. And thirdly, there's obviously been a collective failure in Europe as well when it comes to organising proper provision for people who are fleeing. I should point out to a European audience that in the United States there was a similar sort of case last summer with tens of thousands of children fleeing from 3 Central American states, including Guatemala and El Salvador, and the kind of scenes that you're seeing in Europe were seen on land at US border crossings last year. So this is a global problem. It needs a far more systematic global response, and it needs to buttress the efforts of organisations like the International Rescue Committee, organisations like ours which are on the ground. It needs to buttress those efforts with far more effective political intervention. Otherwise, we're forever running to stand still.
Now, people at home will have watched Alex Crawford's report and have seen that the detention centres, well, actually holding pens, we're probably glorifying them, calling them detention centres, and wondered why, excuse me, there isn't anything that we can do to help these people when we know the condition they're in and where they are.
Well, we've found it very, very difficult to get into Libya for the kind of security reasons that Alex Crawford referred to. However, I can speak to the situation in Greece where we've had to deploy some of our teams, and we precisely are attending in what you rightly call, you call them holding pens, detention centres. I mean, I think we know that they fall far short of anything that could be considered a basic level of organisation and living. We're literally building sanitation facilities, water provision, because without that, then there's even more desperation and even more incentive to be carried across the rest of Europe. So there is work going on. My organisation, others are doing important aspects of that. But I think the critical message that's got to go out is that there needs to be upstream help as well as intervention on the shores of Europe. We're actually on the borders of Italy and of Greece, where you see some of these appalling scenes, and there are recent reports that some of the attempts to save people in the waters of Europe are becoming a bit less successful. There's been progress over the last few months, but there have been some reports that they're actually faltering. I think it's very important that a message of real clarity goes out on the back of the report that you've done, that actually there are more people who are going to come out of desperation unless their basic conditions are addressed.